welcome all of you, and especially our speaker tonight, a good friend for many years. I'm so excited to have her doing a presentation tonight. I knew her in her last job, and she was amazing. She traveled the world and explained the energy heat to everyone out there, and I always was fascinated listening. But now she's created her own organization, Grid Catalyst, and she's doing some amazing stuff. So I want to have you welcome Nina Axelson, who is the founder and I guess CEO and everything else for the organization. So Nina, can you take it from there?
Oh, Doug, that's a big introduction to live up to. So I should have, brought it in a little lower for not get everybody's expectations too high. But I thank you, Doug. For the group here, you all already know this of what a precious person Doug is in this ecosystem. And I just think about having worked in energy in Minnesota for 16 years. I don't know. There's a lot of times I don't know that we would have gotten to where we are without Doug. And I'm so grateful for you, and often being the only other person in a room that I felt like understood the mission of what we needed to do to move forward on renewable energy and a more environmentally conscious energy system. So thank you to you too. You leave big steps for those of us following behind. So I appreciate it. Well, if that's where we're starting here, I'll give maybe a little bit more of a background for me. My background's actually environmental science, but I've had the good fortune of working in several different types of businesses and sectors and organizations. And I really have enjoyed doing that because getting a perspective of a larger corporation, very small business. I worked in a nonprofit where there was just two of us in an office in a rec center, being an environment coordinator in St. Paul. So really seeing a lot of different ways to look at our environmental challenges across industries. I've been working in energy specifically for 16 years now. And as Doug mentioned, in a St. Paul company in
E23 is not unusual.
I'm sorry, can everybody make sure they're muted? I just have a little trouble competing.
Ellie, can you turn everybody's mic off?
Thanks. So sorry about that. So I worked in district energy, as Doug mentioned. I'm really grateful for that small business and that experience. I often joke it's my energy PhD of working with some of the brightest folks and a lot of global leaders, looking at renewable heating. How do we heat and cool buildings in a more sustainable way, in particular, combined heat and power? And then you can see over my shoulder, I was really fortunate to work on Minnesota's largest solar hot water installation. It used to be the country's largest, but it was through the Solar America Cities program now 12 years ago, and that's on top of the St. Paul River Center. So I know this group at one of the years of the tour went on that rooftop, and I'm sure folks wanted to go back. It's 144 large scale solar hot water panels. It was a really fun project to work on. So when I left the company, I took the poster with me. So that's a little bit about my background. For me, Grid Catalyst was really the tipping point, both personally and professionally, in considering how much change is coming to our energy system. Just, a transformation like none of us have seen before, in both the way we deliver energy from a technical standpoint, but also the democratization of energy systems and thinking about how we have a more equitable energy system, how we lessen our impacts, all those considerations that I'm sure have been discussed in this group at great length. And when I considered where Minnesota is in competing for the technologies we need to decarbonize our energy system, because even though we've done really well with deployment, oftentimes we have to wait for commercialized ideas to come to Minnesota, sometimes a decade after they've been commercial in other places. One example of that we're familiar with is electric vehicles, where the market was just not mature enough in Minnesota to have the range of types of electric vehicles you might be able to get in California. So obviously some of those things are based on policy work and being very progressive on that, which we do have in some of our state policies in Minnesota. But also it's part of thinking of what is our innovation ecosystem here? Are we early adopters? Do we take risks? Do we know how to calculate risks on the types of emerging technology that are coming in today? Do we have the financing available to have startups and innovators funded to move through what can be a really long, really arduous process to research, develop, and deploy the tech that they have? So these were a collection of challenges that I knew Minnesota had specifically, and I'll talk about kind of where we sit across compared to the rest of the country. And climate change is the most urgent issue. So to know that we need to move faster, we need to do more, and we need to be thoughtful about what Minnesota needs as a cold climate region that also has a split between different types of land use and biomes and all these things. Like what does Minnesota need to be economically competitive in this space, to deploy the tech we need to decarbonize, and to be thoughtful about how we do that here in Minnesota. So that's the origin story for Grid Catalyst. Started planning for this in 2020. We launched in 2021. We are in partnership with Clean Energy Economy Minnesota. If you're not familiar, they're a really wonderful group that's been around for about 6 years now, and really works on how to strengthen clean energy businesses, our solar installers, the companies doing energy efficiency, folks like Mortenson Construction who are out there deploying the technology. So they are a really wonderful company with, I think, over 45 members in Minnesota of businesses with the goal of 100,000 clean energy jobs by 2030. So just a really great organization. I want to make sure I give a nod to, because they've been really helpful with us standing up the program. So these slides are here for a reason. I'll help prompt me as I move through telling you more about us. But you know, our core mission is about equitable pathways for both entrepreneurs and technologies. I love technology. I can nerd out on technology all day, but we have to look at the human side of this work. That human side is about who gets to come to the table, how do people with ideas get to the table and get power and access and money to move their ideas forward and the training they need, but also making sure that once they have developed those ideas, that we support them to get into the marketplace, because these can be thin times when you're developing a solution and trying to find folks who are willing to invest in you. And we want to be the support system for them. So we're about partnerships, we're about emerging tech, we're about innovation, and we're about people. So I mentioned some of these things as kind of what things face emerging tech and innovation in Minnesota. So most startups in energy technology come through research labs, higher education that has a deep research bench. Some of these things are in partnership with national labs. Unlike other sectors where folks do tend to be, if you're making a new cereal or you're making a new dog treat, it's really common for you not to have to go through a more technical lab-dependent pathway. So those have been historically constricted, but I think now as we're seeing an opening up of the types of things that are solving our problems, that's changing, which is exciting, but also they may not have the same resources that they need, which is what we're working on. We all know energy is capital intensive, infrastructure, especially when we think about big changes to the utility systems. So that can be a little daunting to the types of folks who are used to investing in those dog treats and new cereals that can get payback on their investment much quicker. So that type of capital historically has been tough to come by, but we've seen a 200% increase in climate investing in the last 2 years. So that's really changing. We have some hurdles to the folks who have to be the adopters of the technology. Like I mentioned, they may not know how to think about the return on their investment. They may not know how to process the risk of a technology they don't know or understand. They may not have a method to entertain 50 pitches a year from folks who may not have a plausible technology solution. So are all sorts of things that we want to say, hey, so-and-so business or institution, why don't you do more? Well, they may not have the internal methodology to do more. So we want to really fill that gap as well. In the past, there's been low consumer visibility to the energy sector. It was all kind of stuff that was done in big buildings and labs away from, again, our citizens. And I think that when I mentioned the democratization of energy, we are all, as I know for it to be a fact, folks here who own their own solar panels are contributing to the grid, are much more involved. You all were your own early adopters, but now we're seeing a lot more citizens involved in energy choices. So looking at how does this kind of play out nationally, most of the labs, incubator and accelerator programs, which basically means organizations that are helping early stage startups and business and entrepreneurs take an idea, either bring it to research and development, bring it to some stage of development, and then to deployment. That's where incubators and accelerators work. It's a slightly outdated map here from NREL, but Oregon Best is now Virtue Lab. Most of these organizations and platforms are publicly funded. There are a few private programs like Greentown Labs, but like Virtue Labs in Oregon was an investment from the state of Oregon into clean tech, really. So they really are looking at a broader set of technologies and climate solutions. But across these programs, there's a lot of different ways that they're looking at how they support businesses. Sometimes they invest in them, and as part of that investment, they help them get to the market quicker. They may help them get a demonstration project, which is where we tend to focus. They do all the things that are like bring down the hurdles around getting those technologies to market. They can bring them lab space. But one of the reasons I use the visual here is you can see that we're lacking that sort of a platform in Minnesota. We have other great organizations like Center for Energy and Environment and Great Plains Institute, Fresh Energy, and I'm going to leave someone out when I start to make a list. Obviously, MRES, and so there's lots of folks working in this space, but nobody who's saying, how do I help a budding company get this technology to market to solve for climate and energy issues? So we were looking at the geographic gap here. I also just want to pause for a moment to say something I meant to say at the beginning. I don't want to talk at you for an hour. I just saw someone put a question in the chat, so I'm going to pop that open. This is more of a comment. The energy supply companies would preach the same message as the potato chip companies. Crunch all you want, we make more. So we've got that communicated into the recording. But if anybody has a question, feel free to either raise your hand in the Zoom or put it in the chat, and I'm happy to pause and answer questions. I'll also just note while I'm on the slide that I'm two more things. One is I'm really excited that the University of Minnesota actually hired someone who came from the Austin Technology Incubator at UT Austin. It's a really fantastic incubator. They've done a lot of technology development and deployment. Mark Sanders, who's now at the University of Minnesota, worked particularly in circular economy and also worked at Berkeley National Lab. So this is kind of the Minnesota's innovation ecosystem is growing. Watch out, here we come. That's exciting to have that talent come to Minnesota. There's also a lot of things happening in Minnesota that aren't on the energy side, but are on the innovation side. We have a head of the Department of Employment and Economic Development who has a lot of understanding of the startup and entrepreneurial world. His wife, Mary Grove, launched Bread and Butter Ventures that is doing a lot of tech funding. Lunar Startups and Brown Venture Group and others are more focused on entrepreneurs of color. So there's a lot going on in Minnesota, but just again, not a lot on the energy side. So we want to make sure we pay attention to that sector. And then the other thing I was just going to mention is that the National Renewable Energy Lab also works with partners across the country. I thought this was going to be a really competitive space, and it turns out it's a really collaborative space. So even though these accelerators do have to compete for some of the same limited funds, I'm really impressed with how much everybody kind of lifts each other up in this innovation space, which is great. So in thinking about what does it take to have an innovation ecosystem, Minnesota really does have a lot of those components. And when I found this slide, which I did not make, I thought, oh, I could start to plug in all the things that Minnesota has that would really help us think about the assets that we have here. So thinking about companies like, again, 3M, Mortenson, Westwood, Honeywell, Cummins, like Tennant, there's a lot of companies doing really big things here in Minnesota. And then there's, smaller companies that we, Nokomis, and again, IPS and others, as they've done that work. We have a research institution. We have other private and public colleges having a center for energy excellence and a microgrid center. So I'm not trying to give you the inventory, but I just think there's a lot for us to be excited about that's happening in Minnesota that helps support an innovation ecosystem. What we're lacking a little bit today is having that, how do they feed into each other? And does it lead into pushing the envelope on the types of technologies that we're showcasing, developing, adopting here in Minnesota? And so that's where I really think our potential is going forward, is really working on the flow of conversation and working together that comes from a really strong ecosystem. And a lot of our partners really think that as well. There are, as I'm sure folks are paying attention to the good news coming out about the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a lesser known bill called the CHIPS and Science Act. And within that bill is actually funding for a national incubator program that would provide funding for us here in Minnesota. And we would use that type of funding for things like building out our innovation ecosystem to make sure if you're someone with an idea, you know where to go, you get the resources you need, we can build the investment tools that are needed, and really strengthen what we can do here. The other thing I'll note is, like I mentioned about the innovation ecosystem, is we do a lot of other things well in Minnesota from a vertical or market category. So we're known for clean med or med tech. We're known for biotech in many ways. Financial technologies, we've started to really play in some of the mobile app space. Food and ag, absolutely, both at the corporate level and at the very small business level. So a lot of those things have been really big. Again, I would just say we have this huge opportunity related to climate and energy. So benefits of accelerator programs, they are not just to make us feel good, although I have to admit it's been really wonderful working on this program and getting to meet a lot of folks who are very invested with their personal capital and professional capital, not necessarily cash, into this work. But here are some of the things when we're thinking about how does it strengthen the ecosystem here and the economy here. So when you can have an accelerator take a chance on and invest, and especially invest in a startup company, you look at things like their revenue growth is higher. It's easier for them to find investors. There are things like follow-on funding where you look at for every $1 of public money spent to support one of these businesses, if you can get $6 in private investment. Those are some metrics of, hey, we're doing pretty good because we've been able to provide both a public and private good in this, but not put all the pressure on one sector or the other. So there's a lot of, and I won't read through all of these, but there are just a lot of reasons that we want to try and strengthen accelerator programs, and especially in this category. There was a stat I was going to mention on the funding, but I lost it, so I'll come back to it if it comes to me. Let me just double check I didn't close the chat window here. Okay. So this was an example. I mentioned Virtue Lab, and I've told the folks at Virtue Lab that I use their slides all the time because I think they're just such a really wonderful success story in this space. So I mentioned this follow-on funding. In this case, it's a total, not a ratio, but $157 million that they have been able to attract from that initial like 12 million, I think, that the state put in to have 60 companies. And these are outdated stats. So this is like in the first 5 to 7 years of their program, what they were able to create in the space. And so if you think about where these companies are going, job creation is a factor. One that we don't measure as well is job diversification. So particularly important in Minnesota as we look at the transition of systems away from fossil fuels and what types of jobs we can make available. We have certainly manufacturing in certain categories like windows and other things, but we haven't been an energy manufacturer. So it's one of the things we're looking at is how to attract some of these startups to actually make this their home base and start building things here. And that's a different type of job that we can make available that, of course, we're looking for fair wage and growth opportunities for those jobs as well. I won't spend much time on this, but if anybody's like, I don't understand the difference between an incubator and an accelerator, we can certainly talk about it. My general way of explaining it is incubators are usually very early stage. And they tend to be like location based. So folks will actually, University Enterprise Labs is a biotech accelerator, incubator at 280 and University at the, right at the boundary of Minneapolis and St. Paul. They have one little energy company in there called Vessel that makes a small multifamily residential or commercial batteries or scale battery that would, is just coming up on its prototype and deployment, which is exciting. So that's more of an incubator. You're in there, you're in the research and development phase of your work versus what we're usually working with doesn't include that lab phase. So in thinking about, because I didn't think about when I was looking at how to plan for geothermal systems, what does it take from the time you have an idea to when you get into the market? So this spectrum, this timing could take someone 10 years. It could take them 4 years. For energy companies, the assumption is usually that it takes longer. This is why that what we call patient capital, or money that can understand the time it takes to do the appropriate research and development for these types of projects and then actually get to a commercial scale, is so important. Because if you have to go through 4 or 5 years of research and development, you could just run out of money before you're able to get that solution into the marketplace, and we want to try and keep that from happening. Two of the places that businesses usually end up having challenges is what's called the technological valley of death, which means your prototype is just not working. The idea that you had is just not coming together. And if you fail there, we tend to coach that that's not really a failure. You've learned something. And if you can fail fast, right? Get out and try things, get the idea out there, and then be able to pivot what you're doing. We've seen these types of successes in lots of our modern inventions. Of course, I might be able to think of one off the top of my head, but where an idea wasn't the right idea, but it turned out to be something else that we needed and could solve something in the marketplace or make our lives better. So, failing there, I think, is really only a failure if someone couldn't get the resources or the technical advice or the mentorship they needed, and we lost out on an opportunity to solve a problem that goes away. Where we tend to work is at the commercialization valley of death, which means you have made it through R&D, you got that prototype up and running, you're crushing it, great job. Now you have to go find someone who's willing to do a demonstration project with you, which seems easy, right? If I asked you all to, try a certain heat pump in your house, I think this group would be more likely to say yes than a lot of folks might be to try something and change the world, right? But that's just not what we run into. So I try to be really humble about the fact that there's a really great technology from the University of Minnesota. It's a geothermal company that when I was at my last job, they came knocking on our door and said, can we do a demonstration project with you? I said, oh, that's really interesting. Your tech is really interesting. Do you have a demonstration project? And I said, no, that's why we're here, is to do a demonstration project. And we're like, oh, that's really too bad. When you get a demonstration project, call us back. So if everybody does that, you can't get past this point in your development. And that particular company had already been incorporated, I think, for 3 years at the time. It took another year after that for them to get their first pilot project. It was at the Pipe Fitters Union in St. Paul, and ended up being one of the first 2 pilots they got off the ground in Minnesota. They are now part of our cohort, which I'll talk about in just a minute, which I feel like is our apology to them for not helping them 3 years ago, but being able to do something to help them get into the marketplace today. So generally what our approach is trying to match make for those emerging tech startups to get that demonstration project. And the way we did that is last year we recruited what we call our Innovators Network. So if any of you are part of an organization that you think could be an early adopter of a technology and could do something at your facilities or help enable a project, that's who makes up our Innovators Network program. And they said, we'll raise our hand, we'll meet the startups, and if it's a match, we'll do a demonstration project with them. So that also helps us recruit high caliber startups, because they know, hey, I might get a chance to work with University of Minnesota or Connexus Energy or Great River. And that just helps with the competitiveness of the program. They don't pay anything to participate at this stage. They're just coming into, if anybody has seen the show Shark Tank, they're coming to hear a pitch. So then we went out and said, we're looking for some high potential technologies that we think really are valuable in a cold climate in particular. We knew that our utility partners and others were looking for things like building electrification, renewable thermal, small scale batteries, controls and metering, and grid adaptation. We got some of this into our cohort, but we also knew we had to kind of flex to what was going to come in. But we continue to refresh, like, what are the high priority demands for the folks interested in doing demonstration projects. That's out of order. Oh no, I'm so sorry. And then screen sharing stopped. So I'll bring this all back up in just a moment. I was looking for our cohort announcement slide, which I somehow don't have in here, but we have 5 startups in our cohort who matched with those companies. So we have a window company from Houston, Texas, that has created a window shield that can go inside or outside of an existing window and help a single pane window go to a double pane or triple pane efficiency. When we first talked with folks about that, they said, it's Minnesota, there can't possibly be single pane windows here. There are, and certainly opportunities for improvement there. So they are doing their demonstration project with 3M. And are looking at 2 other partners in Minnesota that haven't been announced yet that they would be doing their demonstration projects with this fall. A vanadium flow battery, which uses the conductive powers of the element of vanadium within a metal, in that category of flow batteries that are more long duration for utility storage. They're doing a project with Connexus Energy. And they are going to be on site at Connexus doing I think it's a 40 kilowatt, 200 kilowatt hour scale battery that will get installed by the end of this year to help look at the energy management between a solar installation and a bank of electric vehicle chargers. So really thinking about how Connexus can deploy battery storage as we get more electric vehicles on the grid. There is Darcy Solutions, which is the geothermal company I already mentioned. They're looking at a pilot with University of Minnesota Morris on the Morris campus. There is a grid forming inverter that helps with bringing renewables into more stressed areas of the electric grid, as well as microgrid communication between isolated microgrids that is demonstrating at the Regional Apprenticeship Center in North Minneapolis with renewable energy partners, and that should go in this fall. And then the last one is a little outside of our hard tech focus. It is called Get Green. It is an app that promotes daily activity to become a better climate steward. So it tells you, use a clothesline instead of using your dryer. But for folks who maybe don't already do the things, this helps them learn what are the things I can do in my daily life. And I recognize that this aspect of like each this aspect of like each of us owning all of the climate advocacy or climate stewardship is something that's being challenged. There's actually advocacy that comes into the app as well. So Equilibrium 3 in Duluth is working with Get Green for their Citizens Climate Action Plan. So they actually have taken over 100 actions from their Citizen Climate Action Plan and loaded them into this app for Duluthians to use to become a more part of the collective here. So that's an exciting one that will launch. Actually, we're hoping in September. We're getting really close to having a usable platform to test. So I have a question in the chat. How many companies made pitches to become a cohort? So we had 12 applications into the program. We didn't have a marketing budget when we got started last year, so it was mostly word of mouth through technical channels and entrepreneurial channels that we had, as well as some earned media. But we only had 6 pitch to the companies. Only 6 did we decide really had enough merit and were ready enough to go. And of those 6, 1 did not make the final. So that we learned a lot along the way. We are in the process of recruiting other Innovator Network hosts for our next cohort, which will probably be placed by early next year, and early is probably February, March. Might be a little later than that. We will open up recruiting for those folks a little later this year. It was going to be something we actually thought we'd be able to open up in August and September. But to be really candid with everybody, there's so much other activity happening right now with both, not just the Inflation Reduction Act, but some of these other big federal opportunities that we needed to just pause and look at that. The other thing is we have been working on an equity and access program with the Center for Economic Inclusion. And it was really important to us that we made sure that we were ready to do recruiting and support of more diverse innovators and entrepreneurs. And I'm just going to apologize if the rain hits too loud. I'm sure everybody else is getting hit right about now. Doug, you have a question?
Yeah, my question is, one company that I didn't see on your chart of there is Excel. And I know Excel just did $9 million for a resilience hubs, they call them, in North Minneapolis and South. Are they at all involved in your program, or?
We are coordinating with them on some other opportunities. They are not in our Innovators Network. So the resilience hubs, I think were funded, and I don't know if that's actually passed like the Public Utility Commission yet, but I think those are a little bit different as far as how they're funded compared to what we're doing. We are actually working at one of the resilience hubs. That Regional Apprenticeship Training Center is one of the 3 resilience hubs. So the other place that we're working with them is on this equity and access programming, because we're working on how to support students and early stage innovators who, again, have lacked access to capital, have not had the right pathways or introduction to these types of opportunities. So Excel is going to be supporting some of, we're hoping, none of that has been committed, but these are the types of things we're talking about for partnerships, as well as something that we call the Energy Innovation Hub, which is if you're really into this stuff and you're not totally sure you want to start a business yet, but you just want to dip your toe in, where would you go? Who would you connect with? Who would you talk to? And so we're trying to create spaces for networking, for training and education, for building that innovation ecosystem of partners. And you don't have to feel like, oh, if I don't go to the University of Minnesota, I can't be part of this, but it's really an open collective, as well as actually going out regionally to other parts of Minnesota to work with community-based partners in particularly underserved or underrepresented areas. And so I'm really hopeful that that's something that portions of that are things that Accel is interested in as well. But as of right now, no, they're not part of our demonstration host network.
Okay. One other quick question is that, we were talking about the form batteries and everything and Connexus. Is that, I know GRE is working on that with a 1 megawatt and 100 hours and stuff. Is that part of the same project, or are those two separate things?
Two separate things. So Form is the one working with Great River Energy. Form doesn't even have a fully operational prototype yet. So they're a really big play. And so for folks who don't know, I think Form is based on the East Coast. It's in that flow battery category, and they generally look at like flow batteries in two ways. There are flow batteries that are really like grid scale types of applications, and Form is one of those. And so they're working with Great River Energy. That pilot will be up and running in theory by end of 2023, and I haven't heard otherwise. This Storen, who we're working with, who was initially based out of New York and has some Italian technology, is smaller, and the application is a little bit different of how it gets integrated into a project. So it's still long duration, but it's not at the same type of scale as a Form battery.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, they're not competitors, I guess, is one way to look at it. They're using, because it's also not a vanadium battery.
Okay.
So I see the question in the chat, how is CERTS involved? So the Clean Energy Resource teams have been a really wonderful partner for us. I'm just going to pull up the slide again, because I think this one is interesting. So not our hub. So we actually applied to a Department of Energy program this year called the Inclusive Energy Innovation Program. And we worked with CERTS because I have been part of the CERTS seed grant judging before, and I know the team there really well. So they have been a partner to us in thinking about like community conversations and how to create this more equitable and accessible pathway, especially for folks who don't have a deep science and technology training, but might know how to solve something in their own community. So those are things that we've been thinking about with CERTS. They're also listed as one of our Innovators Network partners, not because they're doing or hosting a project. They're one of two what we call enabling partners, or connecting partners. And so Launch Minnesota, which is part of DEED, which helps support entrepreneurs in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, is one of those partners, and CERTS is the other one. So two big connecting forces across thinking about community deployment, community partnership. That's really where CERTS plays into this. So hopefully that answers that question. But I work with Joel and Lissa and Diana a lot. So I mentioned this Energy Innovation Hub. This is not a thing yet. There's not a place you can go to, but it's what we're working on to go back to that idea of what's a strong energy innovation ecosystem look like. So thinking about mentorship, collaboration, events, programming, you have to have a place for people to go to get the resources and support that they need. And that's just not something that's been as available in Minnesota previously. So those are some of the things we're working on with partners, with the hopes that by early next year, we'll be deploying some education and training events, some of these networking events, and other opportunities to connect people in this work. Again, I mentioned from a federal funding standpoint, there's a lot on the horizon, and we're really counting on that federal funding to be a base layer of the type of resources we're going to need to really build things out in Minnesota. So there's a National Science Foundation grant we're pursuing for regional innovation engines. We're looking at this Chips and Science Act incubator program. There's a program called EPIC. So we're this little engine that could right now that has a little bit of funding from a couple of partners to get us to where we are, but to really get to the next level and help Minnesota stay competitive as the Inflation Reduction Act rolls out. We're going to have to build up our ability to deploy, to attract talent, to do some of these other things. And if we can get some of those federal funding things, we know we'll be able to attract a little bit more private investment. And I really hate to make it come down to money, because that's not the center of what we do. We just know that these startups need it to get demonstration projects to happen. They need it to invest in testing their technology. It is central to being able to get to that next stage and get past that commercialization valley of death. In some cases, our host partners are paying and investing in part of that. But if we really want to go bigger, we're going to need a mix of other funding mechanisms to get the program to where we want to be in the coming years. So I think I've talked way longer than I said I was going to. I think it is the thing of when you're mostly just talking to a bunch of font names and a couple of faces. I don't know how to read people whenever I'm in a Zoom call like this. So my nervousness kicks in and I just talk. So I'd love to get questions, thoughts, ideas for partnership and growth. Just happy to be in conversation with you all. Or if I need to clarify something that I just didn't make very clear, I'm happy to. I will put my email in the chat. Does that help? Someone asked how to get in touch, so that doesn't make the recording, but.
This is Rich Hulskamp, and I had the opportunity to do work at the State Energy Office X number of names ago. And we did have, and I got to work on the innovative technology grant program with industry, primarily industry. And, and that was 40 years ago, and technology was pretty limited. Lots of great ideas, a lot of unsuccessfulness, but you should have a good opportunity here on this round. I guess the one question I would have would be, it would be interesting to see the technologies that come across your desk at this 50 years later time, as to what people are thinking of and how they might reach that point. And
yeah, that's such a good question. I will say that one of the fun things that I wish others had more line of sight to is what kind of companies are coming up through other programs too. There's a program called Generator that's based in Wisconsin. They have a sustainability accelerator program that's based in Chicago, actually. And they had their first class. They had 500 applications to that program. But it's not demonstration based. It's just a more traditional, here's how to help with your value proposition, things like that. But they had 5 companies in that program that then their next stage coming out of it is demonstration projects. So I actually go to recruit from that program. And there are things like a company out of Canada called Solar Steam that is looking at higher temperatures, hot water applications like industrial heat processing and district energy and things like that. So I'm actually, in conversation with him. I've met a lot of really interesting electric vehicle technology applications. It's Electric is in New York. They have a detachable cable for a charger, which is super interesting in thinking about how those are getting cut off for the copper. And the way that charging stations are built now, a lot of them just have to get fully replaced because they can't replace for parts. So maybe not the 2 most exciting examples, but there's a lot of programming out there. And then I can send this to Doug or Ellie to share with you all. EPRI, Electric Power Research Institute, has a program that will actually do its demonstration day with 15 really cool emerging tech projects in Minneapolis at the end of October. It won't be open to the public in person, but they're going to broadcast it. And so there's, I don't know, I just get kind of excited when you say like, what are the things that are going to come through? I wish more of the public got to see what those things are, because I think that like others in innovation sparks innovation, right? Like, oh, I hadn't thought about that.
Nina, anything going on the agricultural side of things that you were involved with energy or anything?
We've had a couple conversations, and I actually have one scheduled for Monday with someone who's working on a hydrogen project that would have an agricultural application. I'm not sure yet that I'm the right partner for them, just because I don't work in that space quite as much. But AURI and I have talked about collaboration on projects, and when they can send things my way, I can send things their way, as and have actually presented to their annual meeting last year. So that's of interest. There was an applicant out of Northfield that it's what are they called? Oh shoot, I can't remember. It's the one that he has sheep for grazing.
Yes, yes.
Arlo.
Yeah.
He's a super great guy. It didn't quite fit because I didn't think a demonstration project was going to be the thing that would get him to the next stage of development versus, hey, let me help you with your business plan and other things. But Cannon Valley Grazers, that's the one.
That's it.
Yeah. Super, super interesting. And I should check, thanks for a reminder, I should check in on how he's doing. Otherwise, some of the other things that we're looking at are more kind of like rural community facing, but not necessarily agriculturally focused.
What about microgrids? Anything? I mean, that's becoming such a hot topic nowadays. Is that anything there?
Yeah, so the inverter project we're working on at the Regional Apprenticeship Training Center is a microgrid technology. Okay. And Mahmood at the Microgrid Research Center at St. Thomas has offered to be a partner on the demonstration side. We haven't announced that yet, so don't go out to the Twitters quite yet. But that would be something in our next cohort where if we had a microgrid related technology or a startup company, they could work with Mahmood at the Microgrid Research Center. So having those kind of assets like NRRI up in Duluth and other places that, even though we don't have a national lab here, that we can use some of our other kind of lab-based assets, and microgrids would be a component of that as well. So yeah, I think that'll be a component of things, and we kind of hit a niche too, where some of the really big plays are just not going to come through our program because they're going to get Bill Gates money, or they're going to get some other like big lab funding. Those are the kind of moonshot folks who bypass a program like ours, where we're going to get more of those in between folks who just don't fit some of the higher investment potential. The expectations of some of those investors are really high, and we work with a lot of folks who maybe don't hit that threshold. There's a couple questions in the chat here. Please outline the steps needed to move ahead with a project that already has prototypes installed for field testing. The field of study is PV to domestic hot water. Improvements are expected, of course. Ramping up to limited production could be the next step. And then wider field testing. Next steps are, okay. Well, first of all, I hope this person, Pete, reaches out to me because I would love to chat. I would say it's going to be completely dependent on what your go-to-market plan is. So are you planning to manufacture, co-manufacture? So, kind of when you've got, hey, my prototype works, is it the type of product where you really need to get 10 demonstration projects, or could you get 10 commercial contracts, do a limited production of a product, and then get your next round of investment to go to scale? I mean, there's a lot of those components of things that I would want to talk through with you before I say it's XYZ. Will depend on your funding structure. If you need to go out for funding for the next round, do you want to manufacture here? But those are the kind of things that we would talk about and thinking about where you're at. Do you want to license your technology? Do you want to sell it off to someone like Train or Tenant, or, depending on the tech, and see if they want to run with it? So I'd be really happy to talk with you, but there's a lot of questions that kind of go into that next phase of where things go after demonstration. Tim, do you know of any local companies that are working on improved heat pumps? Yes, 2040 Energy is won the Minnesota Cup last year. Joe Stroman, and he's got a really interesting idea of an air to hot water heat pump. And has been building his prototype this year. I think he had a very early stage prototype that wasn't intended to be installed yet. I think he plans to have one by this winter. So that one's really interesting. I don't know of any other companies in Minnesota that are working on things. I will say, make sure that I mention that Center for Energy Environment has starting what they call a market transformation accelerator, which is taking certain categories of technology like heat pumps. And they also are part of like this big heat pump collective to say, hey, bigger companies who already manufacture heat pumps, how do we get better market penetration? Can we train HVAC professionals? Can we help you get a better customization because the product you're selling is too big for most homes in Minnesota, more cold climate. So they're working on a lot of those things. And I can send a link to some of that stuff for folks. But it's something Center for Energy and Environment has been working on for a couple of years. But there's no, Train is based in Wisconsin. And there are some other really interesting companies working on things like, and I mentioned the Darcy Solutions working on geothermal. 75F is working on, or has a controls solution that is a home-based control solution for the most part. They're a fantastic company based here. Zeus Electric Truck Chassis is based here, although now manufacturing in Arizona. So we got to do better on keeping folks from migrating out. Another question in the chat, the biggest hurdle for multi-unit buildings to do energy sparing changes is to get adequate funding to upgrade their grid collections. Are there companies working on more efficient or cost-effective ways to upgrade electrical systems in multi-unit buildings? Yeah, not in Minnesota. What I mostly see in Minnesota are folks looking at financing and policy changes. Like one of the things you see a lot now is, hey, solar installers, or hey, other folks working on electrification, make sure if you're going into a single family home that you're looking, and I know this is a multi-family unit question, but make sure you're upgrading the electrical panel so they're taking in all those costs all at once. And there's some of those things where like the market is now starting to move a lot faster than we're used to. And it's not smooth across some of those adoption pieces. So mostly on upgrading electrical systems in multi-unit buildings. I think that's where we're going to see some big things in the Inflation Reduction Act. And then that hopefully empowers more of our electrical contractors here to set up some of that work on whether it's building electrification or setting up for charging. I'm not 100% sure I'm answering the question. So if Dave, if you want to throw a clarifier out there, that's fine too. But I in general, I don't know of anybody who's really looking at that issue on electrical system transition. Not here. There are like at NREL and some of the other companies and other places who are way further ahead on electrification.
Nina, is EPRI, is that still, I mean, in my days, that was all sponsored by all the investor-owned utilities. Is that still that way, or are they more diverse now in who they represent?
No, that's still who they are.
Okay.
But there's like the program that I'm mentioning is called Incubate Energy Labs. And a guy named Eric Steeb, just was going to see if I can pull this up quick to drop in the chat. A guy named Eric Steeb came from the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator and started this program inside EPRI. And I think Eric is a real game-changing type of person. And so he's pushing these IOUs to work with, and there have been some cooperatives in the mix, like larger, and I know GRE was in EPRI at some point. Come on, you all get to see how I think I'm tech savvy, and I can't find the chat window. So this Incubate Energy Labs that I just put in the chat is the program that pairs emerging tech. Most in this round, I think most of it is software, not hard tech, but really looking at like grid management and distribution. the 15 projects they have this year. So I think they've done it 3 years now. So this is kind of like EPRI adjacent. I think you have to be an EPRI company to participate. But I've been trying to talk to Eric about how could you open this up to co-ops, and especially since like Gabe Chan at the University of Minnesota and others are looking at co-op based energy transition and technology adoption. It could be some really interesting partnerships within that.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if Eric has the authority to, I kind of run off the fact that he hasn't said we absolutely can. He's just interested in looking at, because the buy-in for EPRI is pretty steep for folks.
Yeah.
So historically, this is some of the challenge of co-ops and munis not having, they can't have these same R&D budgets. They don't have that kind of staff to do some of these things, and putting in $200,000 or $500,000 or whatever the buy-in to EPRI is prohibitive.
Are you involved at all with the heat pump program from DOE that Commerce is working on? And I think Johnson Controls is part of it. And it's a development to try to get heat pumps to work at a colder temperature. They said, they've worked for years to try to get them to be more efficient at a higher temperature. Now they're trying to get them in our part of the country to work more on, to get down lower temperatures. Are you aware of that one? And
I am aware of that one. I would put that, and I was going to mention this when Richard noted his time at in the energy department as well, that I think that ends up being a little bit more on the R&D side than we tend to work.
Okay.
So I'm kind of like, hey, when you have something that's ready to get out there, I can help, and we want to be in those conversations. But it's like that's kind of earlier stage. We're in the middle, and then what CEE is doing is really on the, okay, now you've got tech that's commercial ready. Let's get it into every house, or at least every other house, or whatever that might be. So there's kind of like different programs at different stages. But I was going to mention, so similarly, like the CARD grant at the state of Minnesota, which is really research and development focused, we are actually hoping to leverage that for hopefully enhancements of some of the projects we're doing. So since our budget is kind of shoestring, some of our projects are just going in their most base application. But if we're successful in pursuing CARD grant dollars from the state, Center for Energy and Environment could come in and say, okay, now let's really like measure this and test it and have verifiable reports on performance in a way that we wouldn't be able to budget for in what we're doing with those projects. So I think it really adds that layer of research and verification, which I think is great and would be a great use of, I hope, the CARD grant program. But it doesn't, like the CARD grant program doesn't work regularly with our startups because the cycle is not predictable. It takes about 9 months from when the application opens, maybe it's a little shorter, before the money comes around. And that's really a tough timeline for most startups. So
yeah. One of the things I just wanted to mention at our eco experience, we've got a heat pump display, and I talked to the gentleman who supplied us the demonstration unit, and I said, what's holding this back? I mean, it just makes so much sense. And in his opinion, and he's been in it for years, is the installers, the people. It's like they can't get the people that install these things to believe in it. So now their company is now working on a product that will combine with an existing furnace. And so it can, like transition people from the furnace to the heat pump and combine the systems. And I thought that was a really interesting comment, that it's and I suggested that he maybe want to go to the energy design conference in Duluth or someplace like that, because a lot of contractors up there. So anyway.
Yeah, I'd be interested to meet that person. And I know we're out of time, but we need all folks working on all these things, right? Like we need every element of it for the scale of the change we're trying to affect here. So that's why I'm so glad that the innovation ecosystem is so collaborative. I'm so glad that there are partners working on different parts of the issue. the ways that they are, and that there's different funding for those different players. But yeah, having been someone that when I put in a condensing boiler, had to talk to 6 HVAC companies before someone, first of all, believed that I knew what I was talking about and that I knew what I wanted to do. And then eventually when we put in splits, only being able to find a couple of, back then, a couple of contractors who are willing to work with us. We have a, radiant system in our house, and there's so much change that sometimes it can feel overwhelming, but then I end up in community with folks like you, and I'm like, yes, we can do all of this. Let's go.
Yeah. Well, we're coming toward the end, and I just want to throw in a quick commercial for next month. I'm going to get a speaker who's involved with a project at Prairie Island, where they're producing hydrogen. And that should be, I think, a very interesting thing. It's a project that they're testing down there to all the excess heat from the reactors, using it to help produce hydrogen. So that should be interesting. So tune in next time. Any other questions for Nina? This has been great. Super information.
Thank you, Nina, for making this presentation.
Oh, thank you. I'm, I used to work in an office and be all around people all the time. And I love this work, but I miss people. And so this is just really, I know it's still virtual, but it's really great to be here and share what we're working on. And thank you all for what you do in this work too. Well, I put my email in the chat.
Yeah.
My website is in there. It's just gridcatalyst.org. If you want to connect and chat, I'm happy to talk about this. And even if you just want to know more and you don't have a big agenda, that's great too. So you never know where those connections might lead. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Doug. You're the best. And don't hesitate to follow up, folks.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And MRES board people are going to have a meeting shortly thereafter. So thank you for everyone. I was going to say on this beautiful sunny evening, but that kind of changed outside. So anyway.
All right, thanks, everyone. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Tina.